There is no other word for it. Philip Garrido is a monster. What he did is beyond belief. It is pure evil. He snatched young J.C. Dugard from her street and kept her captive for 18 years in a secret backyard prison. She became a mother to 2 children in captivity, and he hid them all in plain sight while the world desperately searched for her. But the most chilling part? He had done it before. He was a predator known to the system, a man who was caught, jailed, and then released to strike again. Tonight, we take you inside the mind of the beast and tell the incredible story of a stolen life and a miraculous return. Before we step into the darkness of this case, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more compelling true crime stories every week. Now, let us uncover the truth behind the backyard secret. The day began like any other for 25-year-old Katie Hall. South Lake Tahoe was a place of scenic beauty, a quiet refuge where people felt safe walking the streets or sitting in their parked cars without a second thought. Katie was sitting in her vehicle, her mind drifting through the mundane details of her life, completely unaware that she was being watched. The shadow fell over her window before she even heard the footsteps. A sharp tap on the glass made her jump. Katie turned, her heart skipping a beat, to see a man standing right beside her door. He was tall, perhaps around her age, with a face that seemed entirely ordinary. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor, a stranded motorist, someone in need of help. He offered an apologetic smile, the kind of expression designed to disarm fear and elicit sympathy. Katie rolled down the window, her natural instinct to be helpful taking over. The man explained that his car had broken down just a short distance away. He spoke with a calm, polite demeanor, asking if she could possibly give him a lift to a friend's house where he could get assistance. It was a request that happened thousands of times a day across the country, a simple act of kindness between strangers. Katie, trusting and kind, agreed. She unlocked the passenger door, sealing her fate for the next several terrifying hours. As they drove, the man gave directions. He pointed her toward a specific location, claiming his friend lived just a few miles down the road. But as the miles ticked by, the houses became fewer and farther between. The scenery shifted from residential streets to desolate stretches of road. Katie felt a prickle of unease, a small voice in the back of her mind whispering that something was wrong, but she pushed it down, not wanting to be rude. Then, they arrived at the spot he had indicated. There was no house. There was no friend waiting to help. There was only silence and isolation. Before Katie could ask a question, the man's mask of politeness shattered. He did not reach for the door handle to leave. Instead, he lunged across the center console. The transformation was instant and terrifying. The polite stranger vanished, replaced by a predator who had been waiting for this exact moment. Katie tried to recoil, confusion warring with panic. She thought perhaps he was trying to embrace her, a misunderstood gesture, but the reality was far darker. He grabbed her with a strength she could not match. He violently struck her to disorient her, leaving her stunned and defenseless. Panic surged through her veins as she realized this was not a robbery or a misunderstanding. He produced handcuffs, cold metal clicking around her wrists, binding her hands and stripping away her ability to fight back. The man's voice, once soft and apologetic, was now cold and commanding. He told her to be quiet, to cooperate. He dragged her from the driver's seat and forced her into the passenger side, taking control of her car. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he looked at her with eyes that held no empathy, only a chilling calculation. He told her clearly that he had a plan. He said he had a place set up, a place prepared specifically for this purpose. The horror of those words sank in as the car began to move again. This was not a spur-of-the-moment crime. This man had not just snapped, he had rehearsed this. He had prepared a location, a trap, and he had just gone out hunting for a victim to fill it. As they drove away from South Lake Tahoe, heading toward the Nevada border, Katie realized she was no longer a person to the man beside her. She was a possession, and he was taking her to a prison he had built with his own hands. The drive to Reno, Nevada, took nearly 2 hours, but to Katie, it felt like an eternity suspended in a nightmare. She was trapped in her own car, driven by a man who had effectively erased her freedom in a matter of seconds. Every mile they traveled took her further away from safety, further away from anyone who knew her name. They arrived at a self-storage facility, a place of rows upon rows of identical metal doors. It was the kind of place where people stored old furniture and forgotten boxes, a place where no one lived and few people visited at night. The isolation was absolute. The man drove the car right up to a specific unit, opened the rolling metal door, and drove the vehicle inside. The darkness swallowed them as he pulled the door shut, sealing out the rest of the world. When Katie was forced out of the car, she saw what the man had meant when he said he had a place set up. This was not a dusty storage locker with concrete floors. Inside the metal shell, he had constructed a bizarre, terrifying environment. He had constructed a makeshift soundproof structure using various materials to dampen sound and block sightlines. There were carpets on the floor and layers of material on the walls, designed to absorb any noise. If she screamed here, the sound would die within these padded walls. The air was thick and stale. The space felt claustrophobic, a physical manifestation of the man's twisted mind. He led her through the plastic sheets, deeper into his lair. Katie realized with a sinking heart that this construction had taken time. He had planned the dimensions, bought the materials, and built this soundproof cell while anticipating the arrival of a victim. The premeditation was the most terrifying aspect. It meant he was fully aware of his actions, fully committed to his dark desires. For hours, Katie was held in that suffocating space. The man treated her with a terrifying detachment, viewing her not as a human being with feelings and fears, but as an object for his use. He shifted between aggression and a strange, delusional calmness, as if what he was doing was perfectly normal. Katie, terrified for her life, tried to humanize herself. She tried to make eye contact, to speak to him, to remind him that she was a person. She knew that if she became just a thing to him, he would have no reason to keep her alive once he was finished. Survival became her only focus. She had to navigate his moods, endure the torment, and wait for a miracle. She did not know that outside those metal walls, the world was still turning, and luck was about to intervene in the most unexpected way. It was late, long past midnight, when a police officer on routine patrol drove slowly through the storage complex. It was a quiet night, and there was usually no activity in the area at this hour. The officer noticed a car parked near one of the units, Katie's car. He noted the out-of-state license plates and the odd location. Something did not sit right with him. It was a small detail, a hunch, but he decided to investigate. The officer approached the unit, where he heard movement. Inside, the man heard the approach of authority. The dynamic shifted instantly. The predator suddenly became desperate to hide his crime. When the officer confronted them, asking what was going on, the man tried to spin a lie. He put on his mask of normalcy again, the same polite face he had used to trick Katie hours earlier. He told the officer that everything was fine, that Katie was his girlfriend, and that they were just spending some private time together. It was a critical moment. If the officer believed the lie, he would walk away, and Katie might never be seen again. Katie knew this was her only chance. Despite her fear, despite the threat of violence hanging over her, she spoke up. She looked at the officer, her eyes pleading, and contradicted her captor. She told the officer she was not his girlfriend. She told him she had been kidnapped. The officer's instincts kicked in. He separated them immediately. The man's charade crumbled under scrutiny. The handcuffs, the prepared room, the terror in Katie's eyes, the evidence was undeniable. The man was arrested, his plans dismantled by the chance arrival of a patrol car and the courage of his victim. Katie was free, but the scars of that night would remain. The man, Philip Garrido, was sent to prison, sentenced to 50 years for kidnapping and assault. It should have been the end of the story. It should have been a guarantee that he would never harm another soul. But the justice system was about to make a catastrophic error. Instead of serving his full time, Garrido would be released on parole after serving only 11 years. He would walk free, his dark urges unchecked, returning to society to wait, to plan, and eventually to strike again. The nightmare was over for Katie. But the monster was merely being paused, and the next time, there would be no police officer passing by. Philip Garrido stood before the judge, stripped of his power and his mask of normalcy. The legal system had worked swiftly to address the horror inflicted upon Katie Hall. The sentence handed down was substantial, a number that sounded like a lifetime of security for the community. 50 years in federal prison. To Katie and her family, 50 years meant that this man would be an old, feeble shadow of himself before he ever saw the light of day again. It was a victory. It was a promise from the state that a dangerous predator had been removed from the streets. However, the reality of the justice system was far more complex and porous than the finality of a gavel strike suggested. While the sentence was 50 years, the mechanics of parole and prison overcrowding began to turn the gears in Garrido's favor almost immediately. Behind the high walls of the penitentiary, Garrido was not just serving time. He was learning. He learned how to be a model prisoner, how to speak the language of rehabilitation, and how to present himself as a man who had found religion and redemption. He became a master of manipulation, not just of individuals, but of the bureaucracy itself. To the outside world, he was a monster locked away. But inside the system, he was just a number, a file that was eventually reviewed for release. In a turn of events that would later baffle and enrage the public, the 50-year sentence evaporated. Due to federal sentencing guidelines applicable at the time and credits for good behavior, the decades melted away. After serving only 11 years, the gates opened. Philip Garrido walked out of prison a free man. He was still young enough to build a life, and terrifyingly, he was still young enough to hunt. The system that was designed to protect the innocent had failed in its most fundamental duty. It released a man who had shown a clear, premeditated pattern of predatory behavior back into the very community he had terrorized. He was placed on parole, a status that was supposed to come with strict monitoring and supervision. He was a registered offender, a label that should have acted as a warning beacon to law enforcement. Yet, the supervision was tragically inadequate. Garrido returned to California, settling into a quiet life in Antioch. He moved into a house with a large backyard, a space that was private and shielded from the street. He married a woman named Nancy, who would become not just his partner in life, but his accomplice in a crime that would eclipse his previous offenses. To his neighbors, he was an eccentric but harmless man who ran a printing business from his home. He attended church, spoke about God, and blended into the fabric of the suburbs. Nobody looked too closely at the high fences. Nobody asked why the sheds in the backyard were arranged in such a specific, clustered way. The parole officers who visited him did not walk the perimeter with the suspicion that was warranted. They saw what Garrido wanted them to see: a reformed man trying to reintegrate into society. They did not see the predator who was merely waiting, watching, and preparing for his next opportunity. The 11 years in prison had not rehabilitated him. They had only delayed him. The monster was not gone. He was simply dormant, and the clock was ticking down to a new tragedy. The morning of June 10th, 1991, broke with the warm, golden promise of early summer in South Lake Tahoe. It was the kind of day that made the world feel safe and welcoming. For the young schoolgirl, J.C. Lee Dugard, it was just another Monday, the start of another school week. She was still a young student, standing on the precipice of adolescence, yet still firmly anchored in the innocence of childhood. She was a gentle spirit, a girl who described herself in school assignments as someone who loved animals and her family, but who was terrified of simple things like spiders, bumblebees, and spinach. JC dressed for school that morning in a pink outfit, a splash of bright color that matched her youthful optimism. She gathered her backpack and said goodbye to her mother, Terry, and her stepfather, Carl. The walk to the bus stop was a routine she knew by heart. It was a short journey. Down the driveway and along the road, a path she had taken countless times before. The neighborhood was quiet, the air filled with the sounds of birds and the distant hum of morning traffic. There was no reason to be afraid. As JC walked down the hill toward the bus stop, a gray sedan turned onto the street. It moved slowly, prowling rather than driving. Inside were two people, a man behind the wheel and a woman in the passenger seat. To a casual observer, they might have looked like a couple lost or looking for an address. But as the car drew closer to the solitary figure of the girl in the pink dress, the driver's intent became chillingly clear. The car slowed to a crawl and then pulled up right beside JC. She hesitated, likely confused by the strangers. In an instant, the passenger door flew open. It was not the man who reached out, but the woman. This was a calculated move, perhaps designed to lower the child's defenses for a split second. A woman seemed less threatening, less dangerous, but there was no mercy in her actions. The woman lunged from the car, grabbing JC with a force that shattered the morning's peace. There was a brief, chaotic struggle. JC tried to pull away, her instincts screaming that this was wrong, but she was small, and the element of surprise was overwhelming. The woman forced her into the back seat of the gray sedan. The door slammed shut, sealing JC inside with the very monsters her parents had always warned her about. From the top of the driveway, JC's stepfather, Carl, witnessed the nightmare unfold. He had been watching her walk to the bus, a protective habit of a parent. When he saw the car stop and the struggle ensue, his mind struggled to process the reality of what he was seeing. It looked like a scene from a movie, not something happening on his own street to his own daughter. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. "No," he screamed, the sound tearing from his throat. He acted on pure adrenaline. He turned to run to his own car to give chase, to ram them off the road if he had to. But in his haste, he realized with a sinking horror that he did not have his keys. They were back inside the house. There was no time to retrieve them. Every second the car moved was a mile of distance between him and JC. Desperate, Carl grabbed the only transport available, a bicycle. He pedaled furiously down the hill, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes locked on the gray sedan speeding away. He pumped his legs until his muscles burned, willing the bike to go faster, to catch up to the machine that was stealing his child. But the gap widened. The gray car turned a corner, picked up speed, and disappeared into the flow of traffic on the main boulevard. Carl reached the bottom of the hill, gasping for air, tears of frustration and terror streaming down his face. He scanned the horizon, but the road was empty of the gray car. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The school bus had not yet arrived. The birds were still singing. The world looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago, but everything had changed. The girl in the pink dress was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the echo of tires on asphalt and a family's shattered heart. The system's failure to keep a predator behind bars had just claimed its innocent price. The heavy thud of the car door slamming shut marked the end of the world. As JC knew it, the interior of the gray sedan was a confined space of terror, smelling of stale air and unfamiliarity. In the back seat, the young girl was paralyzed by a shock so profound it rendered her mute. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her voice was frozen in her throat. Beside her sat the woman who had snatched her from the sunlight, a figure who should have been a source of comfort but was instead an agent of this nightmare. As the car sped away from the safety of the school bus stop, the woman, Nancy, began her work. She did not scream or strike. Her role was far more insidious. She acted as the pacifier, the calm voice in the chaos. using a twisted form of maternal tone to suppress JC's panic. She told the child to stay down, to be quiet, and that everything would be over soon if she just cooperated. It was a lie designed to keep the victim compliant, to prevent a struggle that might attract attention from passing cars. JC, terrified and confused, curled into herself, making herself as small as possible on the floorboard, hidden from the world passing by just inches away through the glass. The journey was agonizingly long. Minutes stretched into hours as they left the familiar mountain roads of South Lake Tahoe behind. The car descended from the high altitude, the air growing warmer and thicker as they entered the flatlands. For JC, the sense of time and direction was lost. She could feel the vibration of the road beneath her, the turns, the stops and starts, but she had no idea where she was being taken. Every mile put more distance between her and her parents, severing the invisible tether that connects a child to their home. The man driving, Philip Garrido, remained focused on the road, his eyes scanning the mirrors, ensuring no one was following. He was calm, executing the plan he had rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. He was driving not toward a hideout in the wilderness, but toward a bustling suburb. They were heading to Antioch, a town of ordinary houses and ordinary lives. This was the genius of his madness, hiding in plain sight. Finally, the car slowed. They turned into a residential neighborhood where lawns were mowed and neighbors waved to one another. The gray sedan pulled into a driveway that looked just like any other on the street. To an observer, it was just a man and a woman returning home. But as the garage door rumbled open and the car slid into the dark interior, it was the ceiling of a tomb. The garage door descended, shutting out the sunlight, shutting out the neighborhood, and shutting out hope. JC was ordered out of the car. Her legs were shaky, her body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. She was led not into the main house, but through a side entrance that led to the backyard. As she stepped over the threshold, she was crossing a border from the United States of America into a sovereign state of cruelty ruled by one man. The gate clicked shut behind them, a metallic sound that echoed with finality. She was no longer J.C. Lee Dugard, the fifth grader who loved animals. She was now a prisoner in a secret world that existed right under the noses of the entire community. The backyard of the Garrido home was not a garden. It was a fortress of junk and concealment. High fences lined the perimeter, taller than average, blocking the view from the neighboring yards. Over the years, the vegetation had been allowed to grow wild and thick, creating a natural green wall that shielded the property from prying eyes. Inside this perimeter, the space was a chaotic maze of sheds, tents, tarpaulins, and outbuildings. It was cluttered and claustrophobic, a physical manifestation of the disorder in Philip Garrido's mind. JC was led deeper into this hidden enclave. The layout was deliberately confusing. Sheets of plastic and heavy canvas were strung up between trees and structures, creating false walls and sound barriers. It was designed to disorient, to make the space feel separate from reality. The sounds of the outside world, a dog barking, a lawnmower running, a car driving by, drifted over the fence. But they sounded like they were coming from a different planet. They were close enough to hear, yet impossible to reach. She was taken to a small, soundproofed shed. This would be her new home, her cell. The structure was cramped and dark, devoid of the comforts she had known just hours ago. The air inside was stifling. Philip Garrido explained the rules of this new existence with a chilling calmness. He established his absolute authority immediately. He was the provider of food, water, and air. He controlled when she slept and when she woke. The sensory deprivation was a key part of the initial conditioning. Cut off from sunlight and the natural rhythm of day and night, JC's will began to erode. The fear was constant. She did not know what would happen next, and that anticipation of horror was a torture in itself. Nancy, the woman who had helped kidnap her, would appear intermittently, sometimes bringing food, sometimes reinforcing the man's commands. This duality, the captors being the source of fear and the only source of sustenance, created a psychological trap that was stronger than any steel bars. In those first few terrifying days, the backyard became the entire universe. The towering trees blocked the view of the horizon. The clutter of old machinery and musical equipment in the yard created shadows that looked like monsters in the twilight. JC learned quickly that crying brought no rescue. She learned that silence was the only way to avoid the man's anger. The compound was designed to make escape seem impossible. Even if she could physically run, the psychological walls were already being built. Garrido told her that he had angels watching her, that he had powers she could not understand, and that leaving the backyard would result in terrible consequences for her family. He used her love for her parents as a weapon against her, convincing the 11-year-old girl that the only way to keep them safe was to stay a prisoner in this squalid garden. As the sun set on her first night, the darkness of the backyard was absolute. The stars overhead were the same ones shining down on her parents, searching desperately miles away. But to JC, they felt cold and distant. She was alone in a crowd, trapped in a neighborhood surrounded by people, yet invisible to them all. The backyard had swallowed her whole, and the long, silent nightmare of 18 years had truly begun. The days bled into nights, and the nights into days, creating a seamless loop of time where the outside world ceased to exist. For JC, the concept of a week or a month began to lose its meaning. She was no longer living by the clock on a schoolroom wall or the schedule of her favorite television shows. She was living by the unpredictable rhythm of Philip Garrido. The physical confinement of the backyard was terrifying, but the psychological walls he was constructing were far more formidable. This was not just a kidnapping. It was a systematic erasure of a human identity. Garrido did not simply want a prisoner. He wanted a subject. He began the process of conditioning with a relentless intensity. He positioned himself as the absolute authority, the arbiter of every single aspect of her existence. If she wanted to eat, it was because he allowed it. If she wanted to drink water, it was a gift from his hand. He stripped away her agency until the simple act of taking a breath felt like something she owed to him. He used his voice as a weapon, oscillating between terrifying rage and a strange, pseudo-religious gentleness. He would spend hours lecturing her, rambling about his beliefs, his delusions of grandeur, and his supposed connection to higher powers. He told her that he could hear the voices of angels, that he had special abilities, and that he could know her thoughts. To an 11-year-old girl, isolated and traumatized, these claims did not sound like madness. They sounded like threats. He convinced her that he was all-powerful, that he had eyes everywhere, and that even if he was not physically present, he was watching her. This was the core of his manipulation, the creation of a mental prison that would hold her even when the physical locks were unfastened. He planted the seed of fear deep within her mind. He told her that if she tried to escape, if she tried to scream for the neighbors, terrible things would happen not just to her, but to her family. He painted vivid pictures of the danger her mother and stepfather would face if she disobeyed. He twisted her love for her family into a chain that bound her to him. She stayed not because she wanted to, but because she believed her obedience was the only thing keeping her loved ones safe. Nancy played a crucial, chilling role in this psychological dismantling. She was the bridge between the monster and the victim, but a bridge that led nowhere. She would appear with food or clothes, offering a soft word or a moment of calmness, confusing JC's instincts. A part of JC wanted to view Nancy as an ally, another female who might help her. But Nancy always deferred to Philip. She reinforced his rules, nodded at his delusions, and made it clear that his word was law. This betrayal was devastating. It taught JC that there was no solidarity, no one to turn to. The person who should have saved her was helping to keep her in the cage. As the weeks turned into months, the memories of her old life began to feel like a fading dream. The vibrant image of her bedroom, the sound of her friends laughing, the feeling of safety, they all began to drift further away, replaced by the stark reality of the sheds and the tents. Garrido made her rewrite her own history. He gave her a new name, a new narrative. He forced her to exist solely within the context of his world. The breaking of her spirit was not a single event, but a slow, grinding process of attrition. It was the moment she stopped asking to go home, because the answer was always a terrifying lecture. It was the moment she stopped looking for gaps in the fence, because she believed his angels would catch her. It was the moment she learned to read his moods instantly, adjusting her behavior to avoid his wrath before he even spoke. She became hyper-vigilant, her entire being tuned to the frequency of her captor. This survival mechanism, often misunderstood by the outside world, was her only defense. To survive the unendurable, she had to adapt. She had to bury the terrified child deep inside and become the compliant possession he demanded. It was not consent. It was a desperate strategy for self-preservation. By the time the first year ended, the physical chains were almost unnecessary. Philip Garrido had successfully built a prison inside her mind, a fortress of fear and lies so strong that it would take 18 years to dismantle. The girl in the pink dress was gone, hidden beneath layers of trauma, waiting for a day of liberation that seemed like it would never come. Time in the backyard did not move in straight lines. It moved in circles. The sun rose and set. The seasons shifted from the blistering dry heat of the summer to the damp chill of the winter. But the view from JC's prison never changed. The trees grew taller, their branches thickening to block out more of the sky, mirroring the way the walls of her captivity were thickening around her mind. The most tragic theft was not just her freedom, but her adolescence. This is the time in a life that is supposed to be filled with firsts. The first day of high school, the first school dance, the first time driving a car, the first crush. For JC, these milestones were replaced by a hollow, terrifying void. When she should have been worrying about algebra tests or what to wear to a party, she was worrying about the mood of Philip Garrido. When she should have been learning how to navigate the social dynamics of a cafeteria, she was learning how to navigate the delusions of a madman to stay alive. Birthdays came and went, with a heartbreaking quietness. 13. The age of becoming a teenager, passed in the shadows. 16. The age of sweet independence was marked not by a driver's license or a celebration, but by the continued monotony of survival. She was growing up physically, her body changing from that of a child into that of a young woman, but her emotional development was frozen in the moment of her abduction. She was a woman being constructed in the dark, shaped entirely by the warped expectations of her captors. The relationship with Nancy Garrido evolved into something complex and deeply damaging. Nancy was not just a guard. She was the only female presence in JC's world. In a normal life, a teenage girl would look to her mother or older sisters for guidance. Here, JC had only the woman who had helped steal her. There were moments when Nancy would offer kindness, perhaps teaching her how to sew or cook, creating a bizarre illusion of domesticity. These moments were traps. They made JC feel grateful to her jailer, blurring the lines between friend and enemy. It was a psychological knot that became harder to untie with every passing year. Nancy witnessed the abuse, saw the tears, and yet did nothing to stop it, her own loyalty to Philip overriding any moral compass she might have once possessed. As the years dragged on, Philip Garrido began to find new uses for his captive. He started a printing business from the house, a chaotic venture that he ran with the same manic energy that defined his religious rants. Slowly, JC was integrated into this work. She became an uncredited employee, helping him design business cards and flyers. It was another layer of control. By giving her work, he gave her a false sense of purpose, a way to fill the empty hours. It also bound her tighter to him. She was now part of his success, part of the household economy. She was useful, and in her desperate mind, being useful meant being allowed to live. The outside world was agonizingly close. Sometimes, She could hear the sounds of normal life drifting over the fences. Music from a passing car, children shouting in the distance. But by now, the conditioning was absolute. She believed the lies Philip had planted deep in her psyche, that she was safer inside than outside, that the world had forgotten her, and that leaving the compound would bring destruction upon everyone she loved. The fear of the unknown, of what Philip might do if she tried to run, was far greater than the misery of the known. Garrido's religious delusions intensified during this period. He believed he had a direct line to God, that he was a chosen vessel for a new message. He used JC as an audience for his rambling sermons. He would speak for hours, his voice rising and falling with a hypnotic rhythm, convincing her that their situation was not a crime, but a divine test. He twisted scripture and spirituality to justify his depravity, wrapping his monstrous actions in the cloak of a holy mission. For a young mind cut off from all other perspectives, his voice became the only truth. So, the years of her youth evaporated. The girl who loved pink and feared spiders was slowly replaced by a survivor who learned to bury her emotions deep inside. She learned to exist in the spaces between Philip's demands. She learned that hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to, so she focused on the immediate, on getting through one day at a time. The backyard was no longer just a place she was being held. It had become her entire reality, and the memory of the life she was supposed to have was fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. The isolation of the backyard was absolute, a void where time seemed to stand still. But nature could not be stopped by fences or tarpaulins. In the midst of her captivity, a profound and terrifying shift occurred. JC, still so young herself in so many ways, was forced to cross the threshold into motherhood. The arrival of her first daughter was a moment of stark duality. The terror of giving birth in a cold, dark shed without a doctor or a hospital, clashing with the sudden, overwhelming, fierce love that flooded her heart the moment she heard that first cry. For years, her only focus had been her own survival, a lonely battle to keep her mind intact against the onslaught of Philip Garrido's madness. But as she held the tiny infant in her arms, the equation changed. She was no longer just a victim, she was a protector. The stakes were raised infinitely higher. She looked at the innocent face of her baby and knew that she could not let the darkness of this place consume this new life. She had to create a world within a world, a bubble of safety in the middle of a nightmare. Raising a child in the squalor of the hidden compound required a strength that most people could not fathom. There were no diapers from a store, no pediatricians to check a fever, no strollers for walks in the park. JC had to improvise everything. She washed clothes in buckets, she hushed cries instantly to avoid angering Philip, and she learned to read the needs of her baby with an intuition born of desperation. 3 years later, the impossible happened again. A second daughter was born into the secret garden of junk and shadows. Now, there were 2 innocent souls looking up to her, 2 pairs of eyes that saw the backyard not as a prison, but as the only world they had ever known. To them, the tents and the sheds were home. The man who held them captive was Daddy, and the woman who helped steal their mother was a grandmother figure. This was the most painful lie JC had to participate in. To keep her daughters safe, to ensure they were treated well by the unpredictable man who controlled their fate, she had to normalize the abnormal. She had to play the role of a happy family member in a play written by a psychopath. Philip Garrido's reaction to the children was complex and disturbing. He did not see them as evidence of his crimes. He saw them as gifts, as proof of his own distorted importance. He acted falsely kind toward them, a jarring contrast to the monster who had kidnapped a schoolgirl. He bought them toys, played music for them, and in his own twisted mind, he believed he was a caretaker. This made the situation even more perilous for JC. She had to navigate his moods carefully, ensuring that his affection never turned into the rage she knew lurked beneath the surface. Education became JC's resistance. She was determined that her daughters would not be ignorant of the world, even if they could not step into it. She used whatever books Philip brought home to teach them to read and write. She taught them math and history, sharing the knowledge she had gained before her life was stolen. In the cramped confines of the outbuildings, she created a schoolroom. They laughed, they played games, and they sang songs. JC shielded them from the horror of their origin with a wall of maternal love so thick that, for a long time, the girls did not realize they were prisoners. However, the strain of maintaining this illusion was immense. JC was raising her children in the shadow of her own trauma. Every time they asked a question about the world outside the fence, about the sounds of traffic or the voices of neighbors, she had to invent an answer that satisfied their curiosity without revealing the dangerous truth. She told them they were special, that they were being protected from a bad world outside. It was a lie born of necessity, a story to explain why they could never leave the gate. As the girls grew, they became bright, polite, and articulate, a testament to their mother's dedication. They were miracles in a graveyard of dreams. But their very existence was a ticking clock. As they got older, they became harder to hide. They had voices, they had energy, and they took up space. The secret compound was becoming too small to contain the life that was blooming inside it. JC looked at her growing daughters and knew that one day the walls would have to come down. But she also lived in mortal fear of what would happen when the world finally saw what Philip Garrido had created in the dark. The backyard was no longer just a cage. It was a precarious sanctuary for three, hanging by a thread over an abyss of discovery. The strangest aspect of the house in Antioch was not its isolation, but its accessibility. For a prison, it had a remarkable number of visitors. As the years went on, Philip Garrido did not retreat further into the shadows. Instead, he invited the world to his doorstep. He launched a printing business from the property, a venture that required interaction with the public. It was a move of breathtaking audacity. He was hiding 3 kidnapped people in his backyard, yet he was handing out business cards and inviting customers to come and pick up their orders. This business became a terrifying tightrope walk for JC. She was no longer just a captive. She became an unpaid employee, the hidden engine behind the operation. She learned to use graphic design software, creating flyers and posters for local events. She answered the telephone, her voice traveling through the wires to people who had no idea they were speaking to a woman who had been missing for over a decade. Every phone call was a potential lifeline, a chance to scream for help, but the psychological conditioning was so absolute that the thought never even crossed her mind. She spoke professionally, took messages, and played the role she had been assigned, the dutiful daughter helping with the family business. Customers who came to the house saw exactly what Philip wanted them to see. They saw an eccentric, talkative man who was perhaps a little too intense about his religious beliefs, but who was otherwise harmless. They saw Nancy, who seemed like a quiet, supportive wife, and occasionally they saw the girls. To explain the presence of JC and her 2 growing daughters, Philip concocted a labyrinth of lies. He introduced JC not as his victim, but as his daughter, giving her the alias Alyssa. The 2 little girls, who were actually JC's daughters, were introduced as Alyssa's younger sisters. It was a cover story that was simple yet effective. It relied on the basic social contract that people generally believe what they are told by their neighbors. No one looked at the 3 young females and did the math. No one questioned why Alyssa never went to school or why the sisters were never seen at the local playground. One regular client, a woman who ran a local business, became a frequent visitor to the house. She interacted with the family often, completely unaware of the horror unfolding just feet away from where she stood. She found the girls to be delightful, polite, well-spoken, and incredibly intelligent. She saw Alyssa as a shy, reserved young woman who was devoted to her father and her little sisters. The client even took photographs of the girls, capturing their smiling faces in a frame that would later haunt her. In those images, they looked happy, because in their world, they were. They were loved by their mother, and they did not know they were captives. The tension during these visits was palpable, though only Philip and Nancy felt it. One slip of the tongue, one childish comment about Daddy instead of Grandpa, could have unraveled the entire deception. But the girls had been coached well. They knew the script. They knew that outside the fence, the rules were different. Philip thrived on this risk. It seemed to feed his ego to parade his victims in front of the unsuspecting public, proving to himself that he was smarter than everyone else. He was hiding a high-profile missing person in plain view, and the world was simply too busy to notice. There were moments when the mask almost slipped. Neighbors reported seeing tents in the backyard and strange behavior, but complaints to the local authorities were often dismissed as code violations rather than criminal activity. A police officer even visited the house once to deliver a warning about the condition of the property. He stood in the driveway, speaking to Philip, while JC and the girls were hidden just on the other side of the fence. The officer left, satisfied with Philip's answers, never knowing that the solution to a massive cold case was breathing the same air just yards away. This period marked the height of the tragedy's irony. JC was not locked in a dungeon. She was designing business cards for the community. She was not gagged. She was speaking to customers. But the invisible gag of fear and manipulation was far tighter than any cloth could ever be. The neighbors heard the sounds of children playing and assumed it was a visiting relative. They saw the delivery trucks and assumed it was just business. They looked at the house and saw a slightly messy, eccentric home, never imagining that it was a compound of abuse. The monster was not hiding in the dark. He was standing in the sunlight, shaking hands with his neighbors, and they smiled back, completely blind to the truth. By the year 2009, the iron grip Philip Garrido held over his secret world remained as tight as ever, but his mind was beginning to fray at the edges. 18 years of successfully hiding a stolen life had bred a dangerous arrogance within him. He no longer viewed himself merely as a man who had committed a crime and gotten away with it. In his own twisted narrative, he had evolved. He believed he had been chosen for a higher purpose, that he was a religious visionary with a message the world needed to hear. This delusion of grandeur would become the very instrument of his downfall. For nearly 2 decades, caution had been his watchword. He had built fences, soundproofed sheds, and carefully orchestrated every interaction with the outside world to ensure his secret remained buried. But now, the caution was being replaced by a manic need for attention. He wanted an audience. He spent hours writing incoherent ramblings, printing them out on flyers, and recording his thoughts. He became convinced that if people just listened to him, they would see his genius. The narcissism that had allowed him to enslave a family now demanded that he step into the spotlight. It was this craving for recognition that led him to make a fatal error. He decided to take his message to a university campus, a place of learning and open minds, where he believed he would find a receptive audience. But he did not go alone. In a move that defied all logic, he brought his 2 daughters with him. These were the children born in captivity, the girls who had never known a world outside the backyard compound. They were now young women, dressed in clothes that looked out of time and place, their demeanor shy and robotic. Garrido drove to the University of California, Berkeley. He walked onto the campus with the confidence of a prophet, his daughters trailing behind him like silent shadows. He began approaching students and faculty, handing out his flyers, speaking with a rapid, intense energy that immediately put people on edge. He spoke of mind control, of government conspiracies, and of his own spiritual awakening. To the students rushing to class, he appeared to be just another eccentric character, perhaps a bit unstable, but likely harmless. However, his behavior was erratic enough to draw the attention of the authorities. It was not his message that raised the red flag, but the context. Here was a man in his late 50s, accompanied by 2 young girls who seemed completely out of place in a university setting. They were too young to be university students, yet they were not children. They stood by his side, silent and watchful, their eyes scanning the ground, their body language screaming of submission. Lisa Campbell, a campus events manager, was one of the first to notice something was wrong. Garrido had entered her office asking for a permit to hold an event on campus. He was pushy, his eyes wide and unblinking, his speech pressured, but it was the girls who haunted her. They looked like ghosts, pale and withdrawn. Campbell's intuition told her that this was not a normal father-daughter outing. There was a heaviness in the air around them, a sense of control that felt suffocating even to an outsider. Campbell contacted the campus police. Officer Ally Jacobs was the one who responded to the call. When she arrived, she found Garrido holding court, preaching to anyone who would listen. Jacobs approached him, her demeanor professional but guarded. She engaged him in conversation, and immediately the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Garrido was defensive, his answers evasive. When she asked about the girls, he claimed they were his daughters, home-schooled and precocious. But Jacobs saw through the facade. She saw the fear in the girls' eyes. She noticed their pale skin, a sign of a life lived mostly in the shadows. She noticed the way they looked to Garrido for permission before making even the slightest movement. It was a dynamic of absolute power and absolute surrender. Officer Jacobs returned to her patrol car and did what no one had effectively done in years. She ran a background check. The computer terminal blinked back, a piece of information that changed everything. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender with a lifetime parole supervision requirement. The realization hit Jacobs like a physical blow. A man with his history should not be on a university campus surrounded by young students, and he certainly should not be accompanied by two young girls who did not seem to exist in any official school system. The discrepancy between his past crimes and his current situation was glaring. Jacobs made a call to Garrido's parole officer. She described the encounter, the strange behavior, and most importantly, the presence of the children. The parole officer was confused. According to their files, Philip Garrido did not have young children. He lived with his wife and his elderly mother. There was no record of any daughters. That single phone call shattered the illusion Garrido had maintained for 18 years. The cracks in the facade were no longer hairline fractures, they were gaping holes. By bringing his secret out into the light, by letting his arrogance override his caution, Philip Garrido had inadvertently invited the law back into his life. He drove away from the campus that day, believing he had made an impression as a preacher, completely unaware that he had just set in motion the chain of events that would finally end his reign of terror. The system, which had been asleep for so long, was finally waking up. The phone call between Officer Ally Jacobs and the parole department was the spark that finally ignited the fuse. For 18 years, the file on Philip Garrido had been a stack of paper, a bureaucratic record of dates and check-ins that told a story of compliance. But Officer Jacobs had seen something that the paperwork did not show. She had seen the living, breathing anomaly of two young girls standing in the shadow of a registered sex offender. When she relayed this information to the parole agent, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy with realization. The file stated clearly that Garrido lived with his wife and his elderly mother. There were no children listed. There were no nieces, no cousins, no young dependents. The existence of these girls was a ghost story that had suddenly manifested in the middle of a university campus. The parole agent, a man who had supervised Garrido for years, felt a cold knot of suspicion tighten in his stomach. He had walked through Garrido's house. He had stood in the driveway. He had spoken to the man's wife. He had never seen children. The cognitive dissonance was jarring. Either Officer Jacobs was mistaken, or Philip Garrido was hiding a secret of massive proportions. The agent decided that this could not wait for the next scheduled visit. He picked up the phone and called Garrido, demanding that he report to the parole office the very next morning. In the house in Antioch, the summons was received with a mix of arrogance and anxiety. Philip Garrido, still riding the high of his delusions, believed he could talk his way out of anything. He had fooled the system for nearly 2 decades. He saw no reason why tomorrow would be any different. He convinced himself that this meeting was just a formality, a chance for him to explain his religious mission to a captive audience. However, he was not taking any chances. He gathered his family, Nancy, the woman he called Alyssa, and the two girls, and began the rehearsal. The night before the meeting was a masterclass in manipulation. Garrido drilled the script into their heads. Alyssa was to be his daughter from a previous relationship. The girls were her younger sisters. They were a happy, unconventional family. The most important rule was absolute. Under no circumstances were they to reveal their true identities or the nature of their life in the backyard. JC, trapped in the persona of Alyssa, nodded along. Her fear was a physical weight, crushing her lungs. She knew the script by heart, but the terror of facing authority figures was overwhelming. She had been taught that the police were not her saviors, but the people who would destroy her family if she spoke the truth. The morning of August 26, 2009, dawned with a heavy, gray sky. The drive to the parole office in Concord was tense. Garrido drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind racing with the lies he prepared to spin. In the back seat, the girls sat in silence, sensing the danger radiating from the adults. JC looked out the window at the passing world, a world she was part of yet entirely separate from. She was heading into the belly of the beast, into the headquarters of the law. But she did not feel hope. She felt only the paralyzing dread of a bird in a cage being carried past a hungry cat. When they arrived at the parole office, the atmosphere was different from the usual routine visits. There was a sharpness in the air. Officer Ally Jacobs was there, waiting. She had not let the hunch go. She wanted to see this through. When Garrido walked in, flanked by his wife and the three younger females, the room seemed to shrink. The visual confirmation of Jacob's report was shocking to the parole agents. Here were the children who did not exist on paper. Here was the young woman who looked nothing like the niece Garrido had vaguely mentioned in the past. The parole agent wasted no time. He directed Garrido into a conference room, his tone leaving no room for argument. But the crucial move, the decision that would change history, was the separation. The authorities realized that as long as Garrido was in the room, the women would never speak. His control over them was visible. It was a palpable force field. They needed to divide the pack to break the spell. Garrido was taken into one room for questioning. Nancy was taken to another, and JC, still clinging to the identity of Alyssa, was led into a separate interview room with the girls. The separation terrified her. For 18 years, her survival had depended on being within Philip's orbit, on looking to him for cues on how to act and what to say. Now, she was alone with the people she had been taught to fear. In the interview room, the questions began gently. Who are you? What is your name? Who are these children? JC stuck to the script. She recited the lies Philip had planted in her mind. She was Alyssa. These were her sisters. They were happy, but the officers were not buying it. The timeline did not make sense. The birth dates did not line up. The physical resemblance between Alyssa and the children was too strong to be that of sisters. Meanwhile, in the other room, Garrido's arrogance was beginning to crack. The parole agent was pressing him hard. Why were these children never reported? Why did they not go to school? Garrido tried to use his charm, his religious rambling, but it was bouncing off the walls. The agent was not listening to the sermon. He was looking at the facts, and the facts were damning. The hunch had become a hammer, and it was pounding against the walls of the lie. Back in the room with JC, the questioning became more persistent. The officers sensed her fragility. They saw the terror behind her eyes, the way she trembled when she spoke. They knew she was protecting him. But they also sensed that she was a victim. They moved from interrogation to reassurance. They told her she was safe. They told her that Philip could not hurt her here. They told her that they just wanted to know the truth. JC sat on the edge of the chair, her heart racing so fast she thought it might stop. The script was failing. The logic of the real world was dismantling the logic of the backyard. She was standing on a precipice. One step back was the darkness she had known for 18 years. One step forward was an unknown abyss of truth. The air in the room was thick with the weight of the moment. The officers waited, watching the internal war play out on her face. The hunch had brought them to this door, but only JC could turn the handle and open it. The separation was the catalyst. For the first time in 18 years, JC was physically removed from the orbit of Philip Garrido's control. There were no hand signals, no subtle glares, and no whispered threats to guide her answers. She was alone in a room with two strangers who represented the authority she had been taught to fear. However, the mental chains were far stronger than any physical proximity. Even without him in the room, his voice was screaming in her head, reminding her of the script, reminding her of the dangers, reminding her that silence was the only thing keeping her family alive. The interview began with a stalemate. The officers asked their questions with a calm, methodical persistence. They asked for her name. She answered, Alyssa. They asked for her date of birth. She gave the fabricated date Philip had drilled into her memory. They asked about the two girls. She claimed they were her sisters. Every answer was a brick in the wall. She was desperately trying to hold up, but the officers were not discouraged. They chipped away at the mortar of her lies with logic. They pointed out the inconsistencies in her story. They noted that she had no identification, no school records, and no medical history. To the world of bureaucracy, Alyssa was a phantom, a person who did not exist. JC's internal world was a storm of panic. She felt like a tightrope walker in a hurricane. She wanted to believe the officers, who spoke to her with a kindness she had not known in decades, but the fear of Philip was absolute. He had convinced her that he had supernatural powers, that he could hear her thoughts, and that his angels would punish her if she betrayed him. She sat on the edge of her seat, her body rigid, fighting the urge to crumble. She looked at the door, half expecting him to burst in and stop the proceedings, but the door remained closed. Meanwhile, in the other interrogation room, the dynamic was shifting rapidly. Philip Garrido was losing control. The parole agents and the police officers had caught him in a web of his own making. They pressed him on the identity of the young woman. They pressed him on the paternity of the children. His arrogance began to dissolve into desperation. He tried to spin new lies, claiming he had rescued the girl from a bad family, that he was a savior, not a criminal. But in his frantic attempt to frame himself as a hero, he made a fatal slip. He admitted that he had kidnapped a child years ago. He admitted that the woman in the other room was not his daughter. The officers seized on this admission. They had the lever they needed to pry open the truth. They left Garrido's room and returned to JC. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was no longer an interrogation. It was an intervention. One of the officers sat down across from her and looked her in the eyes. He spoke softly, but with an intensity that cut through the noise in her mind. He told her that Philip had confessed. He told her that the secret was out. He told her that Philip could no longer hurt her, and more importantly, that he could no longer hurt her family. The threat that had held her captive for nearly 2 decades, the threat against her mother, was dismantled in a single sentence. JC stared at him, her mind reeling. The foundation of her world was crumbling. If Philip had confessed, then the script was useless. If the secret was known, then the silence was no longer a shield. But the transition from prisoner to survivor was not immediate. The conditioning was deep. She struggled to form the words. The name she had been born with felt foreign on her tongue, a relic from a past life she had buried to survive. She asked for a piece of paper. It was easier to write the truth than to speak it. Her hand trembled as she held the pen. She hesitated, the pen hovering over the white sheet, a battle raging between the terrified child she had been and the woman she needed to become. Then, with a surge of courage, she pressed the ink to the page. She wrote a name. It was not Alyssa. She pushed the paper across the table to the officer. He looked at it, and then he looked back at her. He asked her to say it out loud. He needed to hear it. He needed her to claim her identity. JC took a deep breath. The air in the room felt different, lighter. She looked at the officer, and for the first time, she did not see a threat. She saw a lifeline. She opened her mouth, and her voice, shaky but determined, broke the silence of 18 years. "My name is J.C. Lee Dugard." The words hung in the air, vibrating with power. With that single sentence, the spell was broken. The monster's power evaporated. She was no longer a possession, no longer a ghost, no longer a secret. She was J.C. The tears that followed were not tears of fear, but of a release so profound it shook her entire body. The interrogation was over. The rescue had begun. The girl in the pink dress had finally been found, hidden beneath the layers of time and trauma, but alive and ready to step back into the light. The wall of silence had fallen, and on the other side lay the road home. For 18 years, Terry Probin had lived in a state of suspended animation. She had woken up every single morning with the same heavy stone in her chest, the knowledge that her daughter was somewhere out there, or perhaps nowhere at all. She had fielded countless phone calls from well-meaning strangers, psychics, and police officers chasing thin leads. Each time, the spark of hope would flare up, only to be extinguished by the cold water of reality. So, when the phone rang on that fateful August day, she answered it with the practiced armor of a mother who had learned to protect her heart from breaking all over again. The voice on the other end was serious, but cautious. The authorities told her they had found a young woman. She claimed to be J.C. The details matched. The name matched. But Terry had heard this before. She refused to let herself believe it instantly. She asked the hard questions, demanding proof, her voice trembling with a mix of defiance and desperate hope. The officer on the line was patient. He understood that belief was a luxury she could not afford until she had certainty. He told her about the unique features, the specific memories the young woman had shared, memories that only J.C. would know. The confirmation broke through the dam. The stone in her chest shattered. The world, which had been gray for nearly 2 decades, suddenly rushed back into color. The flight to Northern California was a blur of adrenaline and anxiety. Terry sat in the seat, staring at the clouds, her mind racing through 1,000 scenarios. She wondered what her daughter would look like. She wondered if her daughter would remember her. She wondered how she could possibly bridge the gap of 18 lost years in a single hug. When she arrived at the police station, the air was thick with anticipation. The officers treated her with a gentle reverence, guiding her through the corridors toward a private room. This was the finish line of a marathon she never wanted to run. She stood before the door, her hand hovering over the handle. Inside that room was the answer to every prayer she had whispered into the dark since 1991. The door opened. The reunion was not like a scene from a movie. It was raw, messy, and overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. Terry looked at the woman standing across the room. She did not see a stranger. Despite the passage of time, despite the changes that adulthood had brought to her features, a mother's instinct is absolute. She saw her child. She saw the eyes of the 11-year-old girl who had walked to the school bus stop and never came back. They moved toward each other, the distance between them closing until it vanished completely. The embrace was fierce, a physical reclaiming of the bond that Philip Garrido had tried to sever. They held onto each other as if gravity had shifted, and they were the only things keeping each other from floating away. Tears flowed freely, washing away the years of silence. "Hi, Mom," was all J.C. needed to say to erase the nightmare. But the surprises were not over. J.C. stepped back and introduced the 2 young girls standing shyly behind her. "Mom, these are your granddaughters." The shock was profound, but it was quickly eclipsed by love. Terry looked at the innocent faces of the children born in captivity. And she did not see the horror of their origin. She saw the resilience of her daughter. She saw the miracle that JC had managed to raise these beautiful, polite, and intelligent beings in the middle of a hellscape. The family had not just been restored, it had expanded. The reunion was bittersweet, heavy with the grief of what was lost, but buoyant with the incredible reality that they had survived. They walked out of that station together, leaving the ghosts of the past behind, ready to face the long, difficult, but beautiful road of healing. The arrest of Philip and Nancy Garrido sent shockwaves through the justice system and the world. The details of the case were so harrowing that they defied comprehension. The community in Antioch was left reeling, grappling with the fact that such darkness had existed in their midst, hidden by a few fences and a wall of lies. But as the initial shock faded, it was replaced by a collective demand for accountability. The legal system, which had failed Katie Hall and J.C. Dugard so spectacularly in the past, now had to prove that it could finally deliver justice. The legal proceedings were tense. There was a fear that a trial would force J.C. and her daughters to relive the trauma on the witness stand, to be dissected by defense attorneys and exposed to the public eye. However, the evidence collected from the backyard compound was overwhelming. The diary entries, the videos, the sheer physical reality of the prison Garrido had built, it was irrefutable. Faced with the mountain of proof and the steel resolve of the prosecution, the monsters had no place left to hide. Philip Garrido, the man who had played God in his own backyard, was reduced to a small, silent figure in the courtroom. His delusions of grandeur were stripped away by the cold, hard facts of the law. He pleaded guilty to kidnapping and severe abuse. Nancy Garrido, his willing accomplice and the gatekeeper of the prison, also pleaded guilty. There would be no trial. There would be no grandstanding. There would only be judgment. On the day of the sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Katie Hall, the woman who had escaped Garrido decades earlier, watched from afar. For her, this was the closing of a circle that had remained open for too long. She saw the man who had stolen her peace finally being held accountable for the full extent of his depravity. She knew that this time, there would be no parole, no early release, and no mistakes. The system was finally locking the door and throwing away the key. The judge delivered the sentence with a gravity that matched the crime. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life. The numbers were staggering, a symbolic guarantee that neither of them would ever breathe free air again. They would die in prison, just as they had forced their victims to live in a prison of their making. But the true ending of the story was not about the villains. It was about the survivors. J.C. Dugard refused to let her identity be defined by what had happened to her. She did not hide. She released a statement that resonated with power and grace. She spoke of her stolen life not with bitterness, but with a fierce determination to reclaim it. She chose to focus on the future, on her daughters, and on the simple joys of freedom that most people take for granted. The backyard compound was dismantled. The fences were torn down, the sheds were cleared, and the overgrown vegetation was cut back. The physical structure of the nightmare was erased from the earth. J.C. and her family moved into a new life, one filled with privacy, therapy, and the slow, steady work of rebuilding. The story of the girl in the pink dress is a tragedy of lost time and systemic failure, but it concludes as a testament to the indomitable human spirit. It proved that even in the darkest, most isolated corners of the world, hope can survive. Philip Garrido tried to break a child, but he failed. He tried to create a world where he was the master, but he ended up a prisoner. J.C. walked out of the shadows and into the sun, a survivor, a mother, and a symbol of the strength that lies within us all. The monster was gone, but the light remained.